Welcome back to our video series featuring commentary from our expert panelists that participated in our webinar looking at communication challenges and learnings from COVID-19. The virus was one of the most talked about issues across the media from the outset. Not only was it a health pandemic, but also flowed through to other parts of life, including the economy, which placed huge demands on ABC business journalist Nassim Khadem. Nassim shares with us some of the changes to the newsroom during this time, the types of stories that got cut through, and some tips for communicators.
I guess firstly I'll talk about the news that we've been seeing, and then secondly how it's actually changed the way we work in the newsroom and how it's changed things for me personally. So in terms of the news, I would probably say there's kind of two moments. One was the pre-March moment when this was really seen as a kind of China virus, and the stories that were coming out were, supply chains being affected and how that was destroying our economy and hurting businesses. So one of the big stories I did at the time, which led the 7 p.m. news bulletins, as well as our flagship business program, The Business, was about the China supply chains affecting everyone from your sort of smaller wedding dress retailers. So we had this lovely footage of a wedding dress shop in Melbourne that had basically had to tell her brides that be on watch, we might not get your gowns in time, to your big retailers like Harvey Norman and JB Hi-Fi that were worried that they wouldn't get electronic goods in time. And then sort of as post-March, when the shutdowns were brought in and social distancing measures were brought in, it changed from that story to the story about job losses. And I don't think there is a more lasting image of the economic impact than people lining outside Centrelink, rows and rows of people lining up outside Centrelink offices. That has really been the core story, and in terms of economic story, but also in terms of businesses. I mean, you've seen the major airlines, Virgin Australia, Qantas, stand down tens of thousands of workers, ground nearly every single plane. You've seen the housing market, basically come to a halt because they couldn't have people go through homes and hold auctions anymore. You saw, the Reserve Bank step in and introduce quantitative easing, interest rate cuts. You then saw the massive stimulus packages that came. So there was it wasn't even a case of me looking for stories. It was like every day at 8 o'clock, there was just like a steady stream of ASX announcements and media releases coming out, and, we just have to jump on stories as they were breaking and try and, get updates constantly about what's happening, how many people have lost their jobs, how is this going to affect the company's sales. You heard from Kate about the supermarkets. That was like a huge story for us. So I think coronavirus is not only a big health story, it's been the biggest economic story that I've personally ever covered, far bigger than the GFC. It actually puts the GFC to shame. In terms of how it's changed things in the way we work, for me personally, I have been working from home a lot anyway. I had my laptop set up to be able to produce and file stories from home. So for me, that was pretty easy. Basically, once the shutdowns were announced, I stopped doing TV. I still do a bit of radio, but predominantly I do online. It also coincided with our at the time going on paternal leave, so I had to act as digital editor for business during that time, run news conferences. We lost production staff, so I was doing a lot more production of stories as well as filing breaking news. It was just an insane, those first few weeks over March was just an absolutely insane time. We also did see an uptick in our readers. We actually doubled our readership to 12 million hits for that month, which for just the business section, I'm not talking across the ABC, I'm just talking business stories, is an incredible amount of readers. So that's the news side. In terms of how our newsrooms have changed, there's like a roster now of people who work on TV, so that not too many people are in the studio at one time. And in terms of how we go forward, I guess we're yet to find that out. But I think it's safe to assume things won't get completely back to normal. And I think hand sanitizers around the office are here to stay.
What changes to newsroom practices will persist beyond the crisis, and what can PRs do to help communicate effectively with journos in the future?
Yeah, in terms of the practical stuff, I mean, I think we've already kind of changed the way we work anyway. You know, we're doing interviews via Skype. I'm doing radio interviews. I've got a device on my app where I can just record the interview and send it to all the ABC radio teams to then use in their bulletins. And there's already rosters for who's in the studio, which I think will continue. In terms of news, what's really interesting is obviously there's the breaking news stories, the big economic stories, and they're always going to be what we jump on at ABC Business. But we're also starting to do a lot more explainer type stories. So, for example, take the superannuation changes that the government's announced. You know, people can withdraw 10,000 of their super early this year, 10,000 next year. We're doing explainers like, how does that affect you? Who's doing it? Who's withdrawing most? If you do this, how does it affect your long-term balance? So explainers like that. With Virgin Australia, which is a breaking news story I've been covering, one of the things that I found worked really well was a simple piece that says, who are the four bidders that are going in to take over Virgin Australia? It wasn't a complicated piece. It was very, very simple. These are the four people, but it worked really well. People wanted to know a little bit more information about who those four bidders are. So these explainer type pieces, more human type pieces, these are the pieces that are really working well for us. And I just want to back that comment about ringing at inappropriate times and not doing their research about what we actually write. Please Google, look at what we write, and then pitch to us. Don't pitch nonsense that no one's going to cover.
I'm going to ask you all to make a final statement, a final comment in regards to what communicators should be thinking about and marketers should be thinking about into the next 6 months.
From an economic perspective, I think the story is still going to be jobs, jobs, jobs. That is really the anchor that affects everything else. So I guess when you're pitching, think about that. And yeah.